The poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, have often been regarded as the beginning of Western civilization, being the oldest surviving works in Western literature. The figures and episodes of these texts have become a part of our common culture and language. These poems inaugurate a long tradition of epic poetry that includes later writers such as Virgil, Dante, Milton, and Joyce, who in turn constitute important figures in the Western canon. In antiquity, the Iliad and the Odyssey were ascribed to a single person, the blind poet Homer. Modern scholarship, however, reveals that the picture is considerably more complicated. These poems were originally told or retold orally by traveling bards who would recite them publicly. In the course of time, these stories were thus modified with different retellings. Therefore, there probably was no single author. Only later in the 8th century BC were these works written down. Given this history, the so-called analytic approach to the text attempts to isolate individual parts of the works that came from earlier sources. For example, it's argued that the first 4 books of the Odyssey, which tell of the travels of Odysseus' son, Telemachus, were previously an independent unit, which was then added to make a larger text. It will be recalled that it's thought that the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Pentateuch were brought together in much the same way to make a single running narrative. Thus, the poems that we know as the Iliad and the Odyssey are, in all probability, the works of several authors which were put together by a much later editor. The key figure in the analyst school was the German philologist Friedrich August Wolff, with his Prolegomena to Homer from 1795. Wolff's argument was that it was impossible to imagine such complete and polished text emerging out of the blue from a period of cultural darkness with no similar works as models. Such massive works presuppose a series of predecessors and a tradition of composition. In his dissertation, the philologist Carl Ludwig Kaiser argued that the individual layers of the Odyssey could be identified, and each of these could be ascribed to a different poet. He claimed that the poems were then put together at a later date by a redactor, thus giving rise to the redactor hypothesis. The classicist Adolf Kirchhoff developed this hypothesis in his classic work, The Odyssey of Homer and Its Origin, from 1859. The German classicist Ulrich von Wilhelmowitz-Mullendorf also continued the work of Wolff and these later scholars. A colleague of the biblical scholar Julius Wellhausen, whom we discussed before, Wilhelmowitz-Mullendorf published Homeric Investigations in 1884. Claiming that the Homeric texts were a patchwork, he tried to identify their individual strands in the way that Wellhausen had done for the biblical writings. While the analyst or analytic school dominated for some time, there emerged a series of so-called Unitarians who returned to the view that the Homeric poems were written by a single author, or alternatively, that there were 2 authors, one of the Iliad and one of the Odyssey. The leading figure of this school was the German classicist Gregor Wilhelm Nitsch. He argued, in opposition to Wolff and his school, that the Homeric poems demonstrated a unity of structure and composition that could only have come from a single author. This debate is generally referred to simply as the Homeric Question. As is evident, this field of study has been dominated by German researchers.